Richard Gill, author of the new book, Posterity Lost, Progress, Ideology, and the Decline of the American Family. What's your message in this book about the current state of the American family?
Well, I think one has to start, as I do in the book, by showing the really quite deteriorated state of our children and the way they're being brought up and the consequences. You have so many broken homes. You have so many children who are sort of farmed out to daycare, foster care, and other types of basically unsatisfactory care. And it disturbed me greatly, and I tried to figure out how this could happen in what my former colleague John Kenneth Galbraith once called the affluent society. We're actually more affluent by far now than we were when Galbraith wrote that book in the 50s. And yet we seem to have no time or not sufficient time to tend to the needs of our children. I think one of the most striking statistics is that between the mid-60s and the late 80s, the amount of parent-child interaction time, either parent, declined by 43%, and this at a time when the number of children per family was also declining. For reasons which I try to develop at some length in the book, we have become a society that's not treating our children adequately.
A lot of people feel the same way. They wonder why life is sped up, for example. Everything seems so fast. Do you have a straightforward, simple explanation to the question why?
I have a straightforward explanation. My wife would say it's not totally simple. My theory involves the conjunction of two different forces, in a way, two different areas of analysis. I'm an economist by profession, and I often thought about the subject of progress and development and modernization and industrialization and so on. And at the same time, and more recently, I've become very interested in the fate of the family. And then these two strands of research, which seem to be quite disparate, came together, and I had a eureka moment. And my eureka moment was realizing that, in a way, what was hurting the family most in our period was the decline of the idea of progress. The idea of progress was dominant in America in particular, but throughout the industrialized world to a degree, in the late 19th and early 20th century. It said the world's getting better and better and better. Science, medicine, everything is getting better. More freedom, more equality, everything's getting better. And that meant that people lived in a peculiar way for the better world that would follow after them.
How peculiar?
Well, it's peculiar in the sense that because you think of, well, self-interest, and here's myself, and here I am now, and this is what counts. But in the 19th century, people, in the late 19th century in particular, people were living for their children, their grandchildren, and the future of the world in general, which was going to be wonderful because of science and technology, and all these tremendous things were happening. Tremendous faith in the future, tremendously long-run outlook, and as the British historian J.B. Bury once put it, with this idea of progress, posterity took this tremendously important role. And in fact, in America, he was British, but in America, what is the American dream? It really is not just that we can get ahead, but that our children and grandchildren will have ever happier and better lives than we've enjoyed. Okay, that brought the family in the 19th century to a very high level of, almost a mystical level of importance. And children were treated as treasures of unlimited possibility and potentiality. What happened was basically that the idea of progress has been subject to one onslaught after another, beginning, I date it really, with World War I, which didn't have as great an effect in this country as in Europe. In the book, I quote Galsworthy, the novelist, who speaks of the loss of faith in the future, and when you lose faith in the future, your children don't matter as much. And we had it to some degree in this country. We had the lost generation after World War I and so on. But then there have been others. There's been the population explosion. There's been environmental problems. Remember the oil shocks? Fear we're going to run out of natural resources. We're going to run out of oil. The whole thing will stop. The nuclear weapons. So all of these onslaughts came against this view that the future would get better and better. I believe actually, though, that the main onslaught was something you hinted at in your very first remarks about acceleration of the pace of change. The reason people can't look into the future, count on it, and depend on it today, I think, basically, is because change is so fast. There are so many choices available, so many routes into the future, and also, of course, there are all of these possible disasters that our new science and our new technology and so forth may be used in disastrous ways in one way or another. So that the future which loomed as this wonderful possibility in the late 19th century, which our children and grandchildren would enjoy, now, I say, from faith in the future, we've become agnostic about the future. We really don't know what's going to happen. And in that sort of world, you cannot take the kind of emotional satisfaction out of the lives of your children and grandchildren that they did in the 19th and early 20th centuries.
To put a point on that so that we understand clearly what this change in the idea of progress means, let's say from 1900 to 1990, 1997, a few examples of how a parent would behave differently if that parent lacks this faith in the future that you're talking about.
Well, there are many, many examples of present-mindedness all around us, not just for parents, but for the teenagers, for elderly people in my generation. They want their Social Security, Medicare, et cetera, even if that may put additional burdens on other people. It's present-mindedness. In the case of the family, I have a chapter called Self versus Posterity. And all through history, there's this question of balancing the interests of the self versus the interest of posterity, of those who follow after. And what the decline of the idea of progress has done is to shift the balance rather dramatically away from posterity and our heirs and children and so on to self. And you see this in the fact that, for example, people will sire children and then abandon them. Men, they sire children and they don't take care of them. They disappear.
But didn't that used to happen before World War I?
Nothing like this. At the the numbers are shocking. It's estimated now that at this moment, 40% of children will not live with their are not living with their biological fathers. Over the course of the children's lifetime, it becomes the majority of American children will live a substantial period without their biological fathers. That's a new phenomenon.
What were the rough numbers, say, in colonial era America?
Well, except some people say, well, people died and so forth, and people did die. Although I think there's a great difference between widowhood and so forth because of death and unavoidable natural causes and just simply by choice, giving up the families. So the numbers would be very small in terms of choice, very small. Then you also have the fact that even when you have intact families, both parents tend to be working. And it's one of the most amazing things to me is that in the majority of cases now, even with infants, they are taken care of outside the home, outside the physical premises of their parents, even in intact families where the mother's working and the father's working. And this would maybe be fine if we were putting them in wonderful arrangements. But most of them are not taken care of by relatives. Increasingly, they go into, for example, daycare centers. And a recent 1995 study of daycare centers found that the conditions were in general rather appalling. And particularly for infants and toddlers, something like 40% were found to be in poor condition, and only 8% were found to be in developmentally appropriate condition, these daycare centers where the kids are being farmed out. Now, this study was done by people who so strongly support the daycare option. And their recommendation is we must pour funds, more and more funds, into daycare. The question is whether that's the way you want to go or whether, because that represents a displacement of family function, whereas I would sooner see us try everything possible to increase the strength of the family.
You touch a lot of societal hot buttons. You talk about teenage sexuality, homosexuality, teenage violence, daycare, fatherless families,
declining test scores,
all test scores, and all that. Do you believe who will attack this book?
Everybody.
Both sides?
No, no. There is a definite group of people in the country now that is aware of this, and in fact, I think the general public is probably more aware of this than the intellectuals. I end the book actually by pointing out what the intellectuals, and kind of a treason of the clerks here, the intellectuals trying to say, well, everything is really okay, and daycare doesn't hurt, and divorce doesn't hurt, and so forth and so on. Not all intellectuals, but a lot. So I'd be attacked by a lot of intellectuals. However, there is a growing number of people, people in the general public, and now increasingly intellectuals, who simply have to accept the facts. You know, it's a very interesting, I mean, this is sort of distant, but it happened since the book came out. There was a study reported in Science in various places that with mice, remove the mother of the infant mouse is care for 24 hours. And this has demonstrable effects on the physical development of the brain. I mean, it's extraordinary. Now, no, generalized from mice and men and so forth. But nevertheless, I believe that that bonding, that care of either parent, but of a secure parent, not of a daycare worker who turns over at a tremendous rapid rate, who is totally untrained and who does not have any long-range commitment to the child. It's just a totally different thing. So I would say what we must do, in fact, I have a program suggested in the book which has attracted now some public attention called a Parental Bill of Rights. And the Parental Bill of Rights is, everybody uses Bill of Rights for any program but mine actually has a meaning. It's an analog to the GI Bill of Rights. And it says if the parent, either parent, stays home and raises the child for the first 5 years of the child's life, they will accumulate educational credits the way the GIs did when they went off to fight in Europe or Asia in World War II. And therefore, the loss to the careers will be minimal because they will then be able to either finish high school or finish college or go to law school or do whatever, hopefully not law school, but whatever school they want, technical school, apprenticeship programs, just as the GI Bill did. Many scholars think the GI Bill was the greatest thing that happened. In fact, Peter Drucker, the great social analyst, dates the entire beginning of the information age from the GI Bill. And I would like to see something like that awarded to parents who take care of their children during those very important, sensitive early years so that they do not have to pay a career price, which they do at the moment. If you get out of whack, you lose. I'm afraid you lose sort of indefinitely. You never quite make it up again.
Why does it require a governmental response? Do you call for a governmental response or for individual response in your book?
Well, in general, I am not for expanded government because the main reason I'm against it is not perhaps the standard libertarian reasons, but because the government, when it steps in, almost always tends to displace the family.
For example?
It takes, well, the whole educational system. In fact, it's very interesting that homeschooling now, they have to pay taxes for public schools, but they bring their child home, and that's growing at an extraordinary rate. But there's an example where the public school has taken over from education in the home in a complete way. In virtually every program, the government displaces. The AFDC tended to make it, the government became a surrogate father, took the place of the family. So what this program does is very different. It tends to use the government to sustain the family and to strengthen the family. In fact, I have certain principles that I develop at the end of the book, and this is the first one, namely that any government program should be designed to strengthen and not displace the family. That means, among other things, that there are a lot of programs that could be cut back.
I want to go back to a comment you made earlier about your so-called eureka moment, which is important in the development of your idea, because this concept of the idea of progress is the premise of everything that follows. So what were the circumstances when this moment came to you, and where were you, and how quickly did it come, and so forth?
Well, it's in a way it's a development of years, but the moment, the prior development in terms of progress, I've been working on a concept that I called the predicaments of progress. And that was things like the atom bomb and things that were developed by progress that then threatened progress and so on. And as I studied these environmental issues and so on, it became apparent to me that the really deepest, and I call it in the book, the fundamental predicament of progress, is that we really can't see that far into the future, and we really don't know what's going to happen, and therefore we concentrate on the moment. Now, I was writing another book with a couple of Harvard colleagues when I was not teaching at Harvard then, but they were still, called Our Changing Population, and I somehow found myself doing all the stuff on the family, which I had never really studied particularly before, but I had this task, and I began studying it. So I discovered the decline and extraordinary developments, I mean, unbelievable historically, that have happened in the last few decades. And suddenly, a couple of years ago, a little bit more than that perhaps, I realized that it was exactly this fundamental predicament of progress, this loss of faith in the future, that was undermining the family.
But do you recall that moment and where you were?
Yes, I think I was in New Hampshire. We have a home in New Hampshire where I spend the summers. And I wrote a paper called Progress in the Family, and I sent it to Senator Moynihan. And
who, by the way, endorses the book with a nice blurb, a superbly insightful work, says Senator Moynihan. Go ahead.
Yes. But in any event, so we had some conversations, and he actually then touted my ideas before a congressional committee, which was very nice of him. And then when the book came out, or was getting ready, I called his office and asked if he would, maybe we could use something from that statement for the congressional committee, which was very flattering. And his office sort of delayed me, and actually he insisted on reading every page of that book and then writing this very, very nice blurb, which is on the inside cover, about the book. I just happened to have seen him last night, and it was, I went just to thank him for these nice comments. And he said, but it's a wonderful book. You know his manner, it's very flamboyant, and that made me feel very good indeed.
Back to some of the book. Is this book politically correct?
I would say it's about as far from politically correct as it could be. No, it's even this idea, for example, of the Parental Bill of Rights, which is, after all, only an option. I mean, you don't have to take it, but it would be an option. I've been at certain conferences where a number of women have said, that's dead in the water, forget it. You're just trying to get women back to the kitchen and so forth, the diaper changing table and so on. And I would be delighted if men would do it. In my own family, I have some cases of that. But it's very politically incorrect, and I think it makes it harder to get these ideas forward.
Let's go through a number of things. Give us a quick statement on each. What's your view on the argument that the problem with kids today is that they're watching too much television?
I think they are watching too much television, but and there was a New York Times survey on this where parents said that's what's really harming our children. But if you looked at the survey more carefully, you realized that the real source of that problem was the absence of parental presence. I mean, after all, we had the radio and television and so forth when we were growing up, but we didn't have this kind of access. And the parents were there, and we had books and things like that. So I would say television is certainly, by its rapidity, the bites, the quick bites and everything else, has intensified. But I would say the central problem is that the parents have not guided the children.
On page 75, you say that having children is an increasingly bad bargain. What do you mean by that?
Well, economically, this is the economist speaking, and this is what the idea of the future had to work against. I mean, in the old days, children were little workers. That's the standard phrase from 7 years old. I mean, you're out to work, kid. You're apprenticing, or you're out in the fields. They contributed to the family's well-being. Furthermore, they supported you in the old age. There was no social security system, whatever. Now, what we've done now is the children go to college and or at least spend a long time getting through in the home, contributing nothing to the family exchequer. And then at the other end, your children they do in bulk, but not individually, contribute to your survival in old age. So why bother with them economically?
In light of your research, what's your explanation for the high interest in the so-called nanny trial?
I think there is a lot of guilt there. I have to give a personal note. Hiller Zobel is the judge. I appointed him as librarian of Leverett House at Harvard College many years ago while he was a law student. I haven't seen him in years, but I liked him very much at that time. I think there's a tremendous guilt. People feel that they're not really doing right by their children, and then there's a kind of electricity of concern when something goes wrong.
What's your view on those who decide not to have children?
It's a perfect choice if they want to. I would say that represents a species present-mindedness that, if generalized to the race, would obviously end the human race. And I think that will never become a very widespread choice, because I'm sure, although I'm not a biologist or anything like that, but I'm sure it must be programmed in our genes that we do want to have some successor generations.
Your technique is to cite lots and lots of studies, economic analysis, and by the end of it, it's a rather depressing picture that you paint. In the end, are you an optimist or a pessimist about the future of not just the family, but our whole society?
I would say I am neither, because I think the optimistic note that I draw in contrast to all this pessimistic material, which it is, there's no question. And I do feel we're in a deep cultural crisis. But I point out, with respect, for example, to this fundamental predicament of progress, that it is fundamental but not inexorable. That is to say, we have choice. In fact, that's a part of our problem. We have so much choice that it becomes very difficult to see where the future is going. But one of those choices is to give more attention and more loving attention and more care to our children, if we choose to do so.
Will we?
My feeling is that the most important thing is for people to recognize the harm that our present arrangements are doing to our children. That's why I start with as much pessimism as I believe the reader can bear, because I feel ultimately people don't want to harm their children. And therefore, if they're harming their children, they have to rationalize it away in one way or another. And I'm just saying, no more rationalization. Face it. And I believe, I hope, I almost pray that if people realize they're doing harm, they will change. And they have the freedom to do it. We've never been so free in terms of options in the history of the world.
What do you do for a living?
Well, that's hard to say. Obviously, selling thousands and thousands of copies of this book will probably not do it. No, I've had, as I think you may know, I started out in a variety of ways, but my main career for many years was at Harvard. I taught economics. And then at age 43, I became an opera singer. Probably the only economist who's been able to carry a tune.
Well, that opera role is with the Metropolitan Opera in New York City for the last 14, 15 years.
I did that for 14 years, and it was fabulous.
And we've got a few pictures here of you in your role. I mean, what is your favorite role?
Well, it's hard to say. There are certain operas I love very much. Perhaps the role that I'm saddest that I never did do was Boris Godunov. I did the second leading bass role in that at the Metropolitan Opera Piemann, and I was the cover for Boris, so I learned the role. I never did it. But my favorite composers are Mozart. Almost any role in Mozart I consider just superb. I did a lot of Verdi, of course, and I used to do the villain Sparo Fucile in that, which was great fun. I did that with Pavarotti, and then I see you have some pictures there. I did Friar Lawrence with Placido Domingo at the Met and so forth. It was exciting, everything.
Are you no longer singing?
No, not. I occasionally do charity work. June Taylor down in Florida, where our home is now.
Of the Dancers?
Of the Dancers, has done a couple of charity programs on television where I have performed in fairly serious or fairly comic, depending upon the part of the program roles.
And what's your family situation in terms of children and so forth?
Right. Well, I have to. I'm very dull. I married my high school sweetheart, and I won't specify how long we've been married, but it's substantial. And we have 3 sons, all of whom went through Harvard, all of whom have advanced degrees. They're all married, first wives, perhaps only wives, and I have 7 grandchildren. And it's been a very rich family life. I had myself, even though growing up in the Depression, and my father lost everything in the Depression, and so it was very tightened, straightened circumstances, but I had a very, very happy family life. My mother was a singer who could easily have been at the Met, but devoted herself to her family and was an enormously fulfilled woman, a very, very happy woman, deeply. And it was a very happy upbringing. Therefore, I have extraordinarily strong personal feelings about family from my own experience. I feel it must be very, very sad for children not to have at least some of that. And so many. My wife works as a guardian ad litem for abused and neglected children.
Which means what?
She represents the children who come to the court's attention in various ways, and these are usually abused and neglected children and their custody questions and so on. And she's dealing with a case now, for example, a boy who's been in 32 foster homes. I mean, he's 14 or something by now. And she's seen both the absolute necessity of social intervention and also some of the crimes of social intervention, where children are improperly removed from their homes. And, but above all, she's seen a tremendous amount of sadness in these children.
Based on your own experience with families, including your own, and all the research in this book, is there a single prescription that you could offer governments and or society, individual families, that would go a long way toward fixing the problems?
Well, I think, as I tried to suggest earlier, the basic thing is a cultural change in which people acknowledge the problem. And I think the intellectuals of the country have a big responsibility that they're not fulfilling, but maybe increasingly they will as the data keep coming out, making people aware of the problem. Once that is done, it's fairly easy to develop programs like this Parental Bill of Rights, but I have many other ideas.
Are you optimistic or pessimistic that such a cultural, as you call it later in the book, reformation will actually occur with the leadership of intellectuals?
I am 51% optimistic. As an economist, I have to give a number. It's about as real as most economists' numbers, by the way.
Do you intend to be involved in that leadership role?
I am in contact with a number of foundations now. I've never, as I was just talking to some foundations, I have never received a cent from any foundation in my life, so I'm a totally unbought person to my chagrin. But in any event, there are a number of, there's a Council on Families in New York, there's a Heritage Foundation, and so on. And last night I was present for some speeches dealing with family problems at another foundation. So there are groups that could mobilize. I'm a single citizen now, writing my books and articles, and I have a little office in Fort Lauderdale and a little office in my house in New Hampshire. And the office in Fort Lauderdale has no telephone and no windows. So I'm really by myself with my computer and my books and my papers and so on. And I thank heaven that in a way I'm isolated from the pressures of university life, which I believe would be much more politically correct probably than I am. On the other hand, I do now want to reach out and try to get people to face these problems and to think seriously about them. So I may be coming out in my own way.
Finally, you working on another book?
Yes, there are several things, but my oldest son has a doctorate from the Harvard Business School. He's very high-tech. I'm sort of low-tech, social sciencey, and we are thinking of doing a book together called Complexity and the Myopic Society. Not exactly the winning title.